If you're a regular Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener, please rate and review us on iTunes or using the podcast app on your phone. We currently have 935 5-star ratings, and it would be great to get that up to 1,000. And so I want to give a special thank you to the Mandelbronian, who just gave us a 5-star review. And here are some excerpts. It says, "The last 2 Geek's Guide episodes were some of host David Barr Kirtley's best interviews yet, featuring Professor Jana Levin's enthusiasm for black holes and the many ideas for short stories they spawn, and longtime panel participant and fan favorite Erin Lindsay on her newest novel. I've been waiting for that last interview, and it did not disappoint. For the Geek's Guide panel discussions, Kirtley has gathered an impressive cast of mostly recurring guests who enjoy opining on various themes in fiction or movies or TV series, etc. He leads each discussion on a specific topic, and they are a lot of fun, but especially whenever Tom Garenser, Matt Kressel, and Andrea Kale appear together, which often results in comedy gold. If you're any bit of geek, you need this podcast in your week." So big thanks again to the Mandelbronian for that great review. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 446 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Jon Peterson. He's the co-author of the book Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana, which was a finalist for the Hugo Award, and his book Playing at the World is considered one of the most important books ever written about the history of tabletop games. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new book, The Elusive Shift, which explores how Dungeons & Dragons went from being called a war game upon its initial release to being called a role-playing game just a few years later. And now here's our interview with Jon Peterson. All right, so we're here with Jon Peterson. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so back in episode 331, I spoke to Michael Witwer about the book Art and Arcana, which you guys wrote with Sam Witwer and Kyle Newman. And I want to pick up the story from there. So just what was that like for you when that book came out?
I mean, that was a pretty incredible project. And I mean, thanks so much to Michael for bringing me into this. And this is one of these things where it was kind of like Kyle's idea, and Kyle sort of knew Sam, and through Sam reached out to Mike, and then Mike reached out to me. Mm-hmm. And so it was, a bit of a game of telephone, but it was an amazing team that we assembled to do it. I mean, just Kyle's visual sensibilities, obviously, as a Hollywood film director, and his ability to kind of look at the overall visual narrative flow of the book. Mike's experience in doing narrative nonfiction, and, Sam's just immense love of the game. Like Sam is definitely the drummer who's like making sure we keep to the beat of telling the story of how D&D is awesome. And then you got me. I'm just like some, nerd who studies way too much about role-playing games and stuff like that. So I could make pedantic corrections, and definitely in the earliest years, the part that I studied the most, probably make the largest contribution. But I mean, what not to say about it? It was a project where we had to scour the earth for like where all the original paintings were that, graced all of the iconic original and advanced Dungeons and Dragons books, and, get them photographed, and just figure out the whole panoply of like licensed D&D things, anything that we could show a picture of that could like help tell the story of D&D for this amazing 40, 45, almost 50 now year arc that it's been on. We tried to find it and include it. So it was a blast to do. It was a very different kind of research than I'd done before.
Yeah, and it was fun because when you guys were on tour, on the book tour, I had dinner with you and Mike in New York. And so just what was that tour like? Was that a pretty new experience for you, or had you ever been on anything of that scale before?
No, I'd never done something like that. I mean, we were at, Pixar, and, they were working on Onward then, right? And so which has this huge kind of RPG component to it. And so it was really cool to talk to them, and they were really engaged with us on it. We were at Lucasfilm, we were at Google, and just a lot of great bookstores. Got to go to the Strand in New York and give a talk there, and, Powell's in Portland, Oregon. Like, definitely if you're into books and into the book scene and just into popular culture, it was amazing. A little grueling, maybe. We were bouncing around a bit for that week around the country, and it felt like being in a band. And our friend Joe Manganiello, of course, who wrote the foreword for Art and Arcana, and he has this company Death Saves that makes like heavy metal streetwear stuff. And so he made us a tour t-shirt that like listed all our tour dates on the back. And it was the Art and Arcana Tour of Horrors.
That's super cool. And so then when you got home from that, did you know what you were going to do to follow up with that?
I mean, not immediately. I mean, obviously, we started to get a sense that the book was going to catch on, that people were going to enjoy it, which was really cool. And, once that became clear, of course, we were talking to our publishers about, well, what should we do next? And 10 Speed Press, the division of Penguin Random House that we worked on, Art and Arcana, they actually publish a lot of cookbooks. And not like little cookbooks, like super high profile, like, Barefoot Contessa, which is like #1 bestsellers on the New York Times list all the time. And so it was really their idea that we do a cookbook next. And they socialized with Wizards, and they came back to us and said, hey, we want something that'll really be able to deliver some cool, Dungeons and Dragons lore and flavor. And the good news was they also said, and by the way, we know how to make cookbooks. We know like chefs who can sign recipes. We know people who can do amazing food photography and food preparation and plating. And like, so we kind of got the easy button on this one compared to like Art and Arcana, where we were really running around just anywhere we had to go to get this data to put into it. This was much more, it provided what we call the head notes, right, for the recipes, just the things that give you the lore and the connection of this particular dish to a particular fantasy culture in the D&D multiverse, focusing largely on, Greyhawk, the Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, and Eberron. And so, compared to the work in Art and Arcana, this was easy street. It was a lot of fun. It was a project that when I heard about it, I was like, I was grateful for the opportunity to do something that was not as serious and scholarly and sometimes ponderous as, most of the stuff that I write about.
Yeah, and I don't know if we said the book is called Heroes Feast if people want to check it out. I have a copy of it here. It's a really beautiful book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I was just reading up a little bit, and can you tell me about orc bacon? It seems like an interesting thing.
It is. So, and this is a risk of having somebody like me involved in your project is I do love these in-jokes and things like that. So this orc bacon thing, believe it or not, it's based on this time in the early 1980s when TSR, who then published Dungeons and Dragons, they were licensing to like everybody, right? And they decided to actually license to Oscar Mayer. As in Oscar Mayer wieners, right? So they let them produce D&D branded meat products. This was only for the European audience, but so these were available in Spain mostly, and this included bacon. There was like there was this Dungeons and Dragons branded bacon that they sold there, and so internally TSR staffers used to call that orc bacon. And we actually, when there's a license list of theirs that goes with the 20th anniversary kind of internal document within TSR, people, kind of reminiscing on the long path that had led them to the success that they had 20 years into the D&D brand, that actually listed it as orc bacon. And so I was like, okay, we've got to have orc bacon. There's no way we're not going to have orc bacon in this book. We'll find a way to do it.
Did you have any sense of whether people in Spain were more likely to buy D&D branded bacon? Like, was that a commercial success?
I have no idea. I mean, honestly, a lot of Europeans have reacted to this. I've even seen a few people just on social media who have said that they recalled it. And there are pictures, like you can find ads for this whole slew of different meat products of, hot dogs and stuff that Oscar Mayer was then selling for this. And so we know it exists. I hope if anybody still has it, they're not going to eat it. Like, keep it in the freezer. I'd love to see one for posterity, but please don't try this.
Well, you gotta keep it in the shrink wrap. Otherwise you can't sell it on eBay. Right.
That's right. Have to be in a cryo chamber to get to somebody on eBay. But, so yeah, I have no idea how well it did. A lot of these licensed products, they were, relatively marginal, right? I mean, there were beach towels, there were color forms, there were, viewfinder slides, all these great things that like tap into 80s nostalgia for the kids that did grow up like in the 70s and remember this stuff from the 80s. Pretty much every light bright sets, anything that you could have branded D&D and gotten the license from, they did it then.
Well, I haven't thought about light bright in a long time.
Yeah, seriously.
All right, but so let's talk about your new book, which I have read. It's called The Elusive Shift. So kind of what's the story about, how the book came about?
Yeah, the Elusive Shift, it's definitely, if you're used to reading things like Art and Arcana and Heroes Feast, the Elusive Shift is a very different sort of thing. This is a book that's put out by MIT Press. And so this is pretty academic, pretty crunchy. If you're not deeply interested in questions about kind of how the idea of having a role-playing game industry and kind of tradition of games took shape in the 1970s and the minutiae of that, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a stocking stuffer. I would not inflict this on someone and be like, oh, here's some light reading you can bang out over the weekend. It's definitely a pretty crunchy book. But I mean, the subject of it really is kind of about the aftermath of when D&D was released. I wrote a book that came out in 2012 that's called Playing at the World, which is, 400,000 words of detail about the invention of D&D and more of the context and intellectual history that kind of enabled D&D to come into being. And it really only follows D&D up until like 1976 or 1977, which is right around the time that this idea that there was such a thing as a genre of role-playing games had started to gel. Like, when they published D&D originally in 1974, they didn't market it as a role-playing game. Nobody was marketing things as role-playing games then. I mean, maybe in like industrial psychology or, operations research in the military, people use that term occasionally. But it wasn't something that was like a hobby entertainment genre then. And, by 1976, though, you start to see that label appearing on products. You start to see people talking about an early game like Metamorphosis Alpha. This was a role-playing game that TSR put out in 1976 by Jim Ward that was probably their first product that really marketed itself. This isn't like a war game anymore. We used to make war games. Now this thing we're doing is different. It's a role-playing game. And by 1977, when the Holmes basic set, the first boxed basic set of D&D came out, role-playing game had gotten enough currency that's what they called it there as well. And that's really where Playing at the World runs out of steam. So this is about the story of who the people were that picked up these games and saw this property of role-playing in them, how that label kind of first got attached and what people thought it meant. And maybe even more importantly, like, what would it be like to design a game that you were intending to be a role-playing game? What quality should it have? How do you encourage people to be in character? Or what things do you think about a system design could make people feel like they're not in character? And, the argument of the book is that by like 1980 or so, it pretty much gelled, that there was this kind of messy process by which everybody kind of agreed, okay, there's this new thing and it's called role-playing and this is kind of how it's different. But the book is called The Elusive Shift because nailing down exactly what happened during that time and trying to find like the inflection point or something, it's really pretty tricky. It was a messy period where nobody agreed on what it meant for something to be a role-playing game. But at the end of it, everybody at least agreed there was such a thing as a role-playing game. And that helped spawn this amazing, diverse industry of role-playing games that we have today.
Yeah, and so this discussion that you're talking about that was taking place in the 70s was mostly playing out in these fanzines and also kind of in magazines like Dragon and White Dwarf. I was a pretty avid reader of Dragon for a number of years, but I've never actually, and I've at least heard of Alarms and Excursions, which is one of the big fanzines, but I've never actually read a copy. Kind of, how did you get interested in those fanzines and like how were you able to read them?
Yeah, I mean, the fanzines are my lifeblood. So I've always been super interested in fanzines. Before there was an internet and people wanted to talk about games, there were fanzines. And when I say people, I don't mean kind of from the cathedral down, TSR wants to tell you about new releases and what Gary Gygax thinks about, Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, like gamers wanted to just interact with other gamers and say, here's my ideas about how to do this, or here's what I think about that. The thing that's the equivalent of the internet forums and the Facebook groups and things like that we interact with today at the time were these zines. And so they're the primary material that I study, that I work on, are gaming zines from the 60s and 70s. And Alarms and Excursions is by far the most important and influential of these for understanding this initial period. It was the first zine that was published where really different people's voices started to talk about, well, this is my experience of the game. This is how I'm doing it. Like, how are you doing it? And it started late in the spring, early summer of 1975 and has actually appeared monthly every month since. It is
This
still going today.
Out of Los Angeles, right?
It is, yeah. Lee Gold is the responsible party, and Lee is she's an amazing woman who I've been over to her house. I have some good anecdotes about that, but yeah, she started this as a splinter off of a group that was called the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, or LASFIS. And LASFIS had been running a weekly zine, literally made like every week. Every time the LASFIS group met in Los Angeles, they would put out a zine, like kind of from the meeting. And, this had now been into probably 2000, maybe a little more issues by the time that Alarms and Excursions kind of split off from it. But, Alarms is a monthly, and the basic idea behind zines that are structured this way, we call them APAs, Amateur Press Associations, is that everybody can kind of send in their own section, almost like maybe your own forum post on a forum that, then it gets collated. And all of those individual sections people send in, they get mailed to everyone who participated in it. You could also kind of subscribe if you weren't a participant. If you paid Lee, she'd send you copies for it. But it was really focused on that collaboration and that this notion that like everybody's going to contribute something to the discussion. And like I said, the early discussions that emerged then in 1975 about how to approach D&D and really what it might be like to design whatever some people thought maybe D&D should have been, what kinds of rules it should have, and what this all had to do with role-playing. Like Alarms is one of the main things to follow to understand how that all went down in the 70s.
Yeah, and it was really striking to me reading your book to see how much bafflement there was over the concept of a role-playing game initially, and just how long it took and how many disagreements there were over just some of the basic stuff that we take for granted. So like there were arguments about whether players should be rolling dice at all, or should the dungeon master just be rolling the dice, because the players might learn things that they're not, like if they roll a 20 and they miss, then they know that there's magic involved or something that the character that they're playing shouldn't know, things like that. And also I was really struck, one of these writers in a fanzine was arguing that he said he just banned his players from ever speaking in the voice of the character because he didn't want them to identify with their characters too much. It's just so different than kind of what we think of RPGs today.
It is. And actually, Lee Gold was one of the people who advocated for not having that strong a sense of identification, because she felt that it made people too uptight about what was happening in the game, right? Like if you feel like this character is you and these things are happening to you, she kind of urged people to speak in the third person, not even to speak in like the first person voice of your character for that reason. Now she would, I think our views about this been changed over time, but like a lot of people early on were concerned that the level of immersion that these games offered could lead to disputes and real emotional breakdowns, right, from people. And there's plenty of evidence looking at these early accounts that sometimes it did. And, this whole question of what it means to take on a character and play it is really what a lot of the Elusive Shift is about. And the degree to which the system of a game constrains what you do or determines what you do when you're playing a character versus kind of either your personal ingenuity, right? As a player, well, I think my character in this situation should do this, but my character's intelligence is very low. Does that mean that my character wouldn't think of that and I should propose that my character not do it? That was an early litmus test that people proposed for whether what you were doing was really role-playing, right? Because they kind of viewed, at least some did, and like it was enormously controversial and everybody seemed to have different views about it. But, some argued that was like a line in the sand, that if you weren't willing to, restrict what you did to the way that the system characterized your character, you weren't really playing a role-playing game. It was something else.
I thought it was interesting in that discussion that all the conversation revolved around, if my character's intelligence is lower than mine, am I obliged to play stupider? And it never came up, well, if my character's intelligence is much higher than mine, is the DM obligated to say to me, like, no, sorry, Joe, you're way too dumb. Your character would never do something as dumb as what you just suggested.
Yeah, there was a bit of that. I think you do see a bit of that. You do see the notion that, I think even there's another place I think I chalk it up to Lee Gold, if I recall, this notion that they used the term calling at the time. And this is based on this idea that there was a caller which may not be familiar to anybody who reads RPGs today, but was kind of important in the first couple of years of after D&D came out, because D&D had this notion that there was a player who was kind of a privileged player who would call for the party. It was kind of this single voice that was talking to the dungeon master, to the referee, saying, okay, this is what we all do. And, the idea of whether you calls should be able to be overridden by the referee, because the referee says, well, you just wouldn't do that based on who this particular character is. That's certainly something that people very early on latched onto. And I think it's probably a rule that was, honored more in the breach than the observance. Right? The original D&D rules, they weren't super specific and they weren't really clear about it. The only place that they bring this up that, you really see a lot of trace of is with intelligence in the original D&D rules, where it does say intelligence may determine whether the referee would, allow you to do the action that you're describing for, this particular character. And it was just these one-off kind of oblique statements buried in the 1974 D&D rules that people looked at and kind of magnified and said, well, okay, what are the implications of this? Like, what does this mean for the way that we should approach this game? And interestingly, that quickly transposes into, can we do better? Right? Like, a good example of that with abilities is, the drive that started to appear pretty early on for people to want to have different abilities for their characters than dice would just randomly generate, right? Who wanted more control over what kind of character they could play. And when you look at a game like Chivalry and Sorcery, which is an early competing RPG, that's one that definitely does encourage you, if you have a low intelligence, to behave like an idiot and says, it's fun, right? Or if you have a low dexterity and you're a thief, that you shouldn't be sad about that, right? You should play it up because it's entertaining, it's comic, and so on. But pretty quickly, people push back and we're like, well, I want to have more agency as a player in determining what kind of character I want to take on. This is more a role that I am curating for myself and inventing for myself instead of something that you're imposing on me. And, from that, you start to see, instead of rolling for abilities, things like point buy systems, where instead you kind of make it decisions about how you're going to allocate your ability points. And thus, if you want to play an idiotic thief, it's your decision to be playing an idiotic thief, and you feel that kind of agency to it. And definitely a lot of chapter 3 of Elusive Shift is about precisely this as it plays out across a couple different areas in early RPG system design.
Yeah, and it seems like this is the big argument that goes on over hundreds of these zines, is based because Dungeons & Dragons kind of comes out of this wargaming subculture, and then it attracts a lot of its early players from fantasy and science fiction fandom. And so there's this sort of conflict between, is this more of a game where you're trying to succeed in these quests, or is it more of a sort of a dramatic exercise where you're trying to really get into character and play your character? And you just see that argument in various forms recur over and over and over and over again. And there seemed to be sort of this feeling that new players were more drawn to winning and experienced players were more drawn to, getting into character. And I've been very, very obsessed with Dungeons & Dragons for a long time, and I've never had the opportunity to play it too much. I mean, I've played maybe, 15, 20 times in my whole life. And I would say I'm still at that phase where I want to have adventures, and I'm not so interested in, acting like a character. So I was feeling like, I don't know. I was feeling like maybe not as sophisticated, reading some of these arguments, but that's kind of where I am. Is I'm still in the, kill the monsters, get the treasure. Like, even just that would be a blast for me.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there's games out there like Diablo, right, which are skinned and perfected to, go down to dungeons, kill monsters, come back with gold and stuff. And these games are enormously popular, right? And take your pick of any CRPG, like any tentpole CRPG. Dungeoneering is such a huge component of them, and that kind of search for power. It's something that's like compelling to us. And I mean, I always take heart when I look at, and this gets more towards the end of the Elusive Shift, somebody like Glenn Blacko, who, was the person who really created the first player typologies where it said, well, okay, some kinds of players want to play this way, some kind of players want to play this way. He created the one that was, in a way, the most popular of the 1980s, where, some players came in, as he said, to do power gaming, right? To just get more powerful. Other players went in for role playing. They wanted to have this experience of like being in character and this kind of more acting and theatrical dimension, whereas others wanted to do wargaming to experience this simulation, right, of what this world would be like, that it obeys these logical rules and has these interesting tactical situations that you try to resolve. But even Glenn, with his perspective on these typologies, he understood that power gaming even appealed to him, right? Like he wants a game where there's a certain amount of, you're going to go up and experience, your character has an arc, and that arc of kind of rags to riches, right? It's this in Playing at the World, I called it a kind of capitalist fantasy, right? Of like endlessly accumulating treasure or things like that. Maybe a self-improvement fantasy, if you could just keep working out like every day, then you'd be, Schwarzenegger, right? Or something like that, right? This idea that practice would yield such easy returns, it is a huge part of the appeal of games that are in the tradition of Dungeons and Dragons. And, people certainly felt that if you removed that element, it would lessen the market for it in a variety of ways. And so you see a lot of people, again, trying to strike a balance, trying to say like, okay, how much role playing do you want? How much kind of tactical adventure do you want? How much, becoming a super person do you want? How much storytelling, right? How much do you want this to be part of this overarching narrative where the referee or dungeon master has this elaborate world situation and is constantly throwing you curveballs you're supposed to react to that drive forward this incredible epic adventure? His argument was always, you got to find the balances of that appeal to you and the people around your table. And it's that customizability, it's that artisanal, capability that's built into D&D to kind of let the people sitting down around the table hash out how many of those elements they want and at what degree. And even though they're in a tension with each other, to kind of find what works for you, that has made it just such an transformative experience for myself and so many other people that grew up with it.
Yeah, and in Blackout's typology, the things are role-playing, wargaming, power gaming, and storytelling. And I would say if you're drawing a distinction between wargaming and power gaming, I'd be more in the wargaming section where, it's not like I'll die if I don't get 1 million gold pieces, but it's more about, can I outwit the traps? Can I pick the right combat strategies to survive? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, and some people actually propose that there should be another typology for puzzle solving, precisely for, people who love these elaborate contraptions that they need to figure out how to get through this temple by removing this jewel from this statue's eye and putting it in this other statue's eye or whatever. Everybody was always playing with those categories the same way everyone was always hacking D&D. Everyone was always just trying to get what you wanted out of it. And it's just as a tool for self-expression and for generating experiences you want to have. D&D and the games in this early tradition, they really did just unlock something, this incredible creativity and this new experience. You hear early critics, not just kids in fanzines, but, John Freeman, who wrote for Games Magazine and wrote, mainstream books about this, saying that, D&D might turn out to be like one of the most important, discoveries of your life. When you just come into contact with just what this has to offer. It's an experience.
Well, right. And as the sort of years go by, you see a lot of critics becoming more dismissive of dungeon crawls. But I thought it was really interesting. At one point, one of the writers is saying, like, no, this is really tapping into deep, like Jungian archetype kind of stuff, the descent into the underworld, that there's something that really resonates with people. There's a reason this is popular, this idea of going down into the earth and facing some challenge and emerging triumphant.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that guy. I'm curious, honestly. So this book isn't out yet. For the time we're recording this anyway, it'll be out next week. I'm curious what people make of my account of Bachman. I find him a fascinating figure, and he comes up in a chapter that kind of is a bit of a survey of all the different ways people tried to position what these new role-playing games meant. And there were people who said, well, this is an emerging art form. This is performative art. It's improvisational theater. It's something that's being created in our lifetime. And it's profoundly exciting to be part of a new art form coming together. And then there were people who were like, Gary Gygax saying, no, it's really just a game. This is just a diversion, simple diversion, beer and pretzels, don't get carried away. Like none of this magic stuff or whatever is real. And other people who compared it to psychodramas, and certainly role playing does have historically connections to psychotherapy and things like it. And there are people then who would position that more, well, it's like a tool through which you can explore morality and yourself and, things like that. But then this guy Bachman came along and was like, nah, I think you're all wrong, actually. I think this is a game about giving you access to the supernatural. And like, at a time, by the way, when this satanic panic thing we always talk about was kind of starting to blossom a bit, he was very much engaged with the possibilities of, experiencing the hero's journey, like straight out of Campbell, yes, and straight out of Jung, that were built into this. And he went farther than merely speculating about, based on his reading of Eliade and, authors like that, that, you could create a system that would kind of steer people in a way that follows the hero's journey. Right. And a part of that is, like, as you said, the descent into the underworld, leaving the home area and like going out to a place of adventure where you'll encounter and eventually overcome these things and then return ultimately to a renewed and refreshed world. You don't see people talking about war games that way, right? When I talk about the elusive shift, that there was this transition that happened, like, you don't see people looking at, a war game and claiming that it gives you access to the realm of fairy, which is literally what this guy argued. So he fascinates me because, it's such an esoteric way to think about it. But at the same time, the fact that he had a whole system designed around it that he thought could really steer people into that path. Just fascinates me as an effort.
Yeah, well, and you used the word psychodrama, and could you talk more about what that means? Because I thought that was interesting because, yeah, like so much of the commentary is assuming that the highest form of role-playing is to get into a character. And this guy was saying, or this writer was saying, if you're playing Conan the Barbarian, that's actually less meaningful than if you're playing yourself and learning things about yourself in the course of play.
Definitely. And so this goes back, there's this guy Moreno who really coined the term role-playing game, who interestingly had kind of a double background. He was involved in psychotherapy in Europe and then also in improvisational theater. And there are a bunch of literary sources that he drew on, which I don't actually go into too much in The Elusive Shift. There's a famous Goethe piece that he was imitating in particular about a person who goes insane, and then to treat this person, the doctors create this elaborate acted out fantasy to try to, Quixote, like make him think that, he could navigate these problems, this insane fantasy world, through this huge kind of improvisational psychodrama. So psychodrama is a huge component of it. And, one of my favorite stories about this is one that Larry DiTillio tells, where he talks about running D&D for some kids at a convention, including this young player who was a paladin. And, at one point in DiTillio's dungeon, there's a brothel, effectively. And the paladin kind of asks him, well, is it lawful for me? Is it lawful good for me to take advantage of this? Like, is sex bad? And DiTillio, who's older and is running for these teenagers, is really just taken aback by the responsibility he's just been given to kind of tell this kid, well, is sex in this context not good? And, the best he can really do is to kind of put it back to the kid and say, I personally don't think sex is bad, but this is really, it's a choice that people differ on, and you kind of have to figure that out for yourself. And the way that our characters and ourselves as players bleed together is certainly a major theme of The Elusive Shift, the way people tried to attack that. And then contemporary RPG theory, this is now a subject that's way studied academically, more than the kind of infancy of it I talk about in the 1970s. There is a lot of literature about this, about really what the relationship is between, say, conflict you might have, your character might with another character in a LARP, say, versus what really we feel of that as people, and how much that kind of bleeds through into our relationships with others. These are huge, complicated questions. And I think the Elusive Shift is really trying to show they've always been with us, that people saw these things just from the moment D&D came out. There there aren't easy answers to a lot of these questions. I think still today, people who are designing RPGs are experimenting with the right way to position these things, the right way to talk about kind of what these games mean to us and how best to approach them. And I guess the objective of the Elusive Shift is in some ways just to show how these tensions were built in to role-playing games from the start. And they probably won't ever admit of any satisfactory, definitive solution that'll work for everyone, because everyone comes to it with kind of different incentives, different goals, different things they want.
Well, right, because my experience, as a teenager, reading the Dungeons and Dragons rule books, because, I had like 20 different books or something, and I was just kind of like, how can anyone memorize all these rules and apply them consistently? And, and especially reading these fanzines, it seems like nobody really did. I mean,
Many did, yeah.
There's this amazing part. I wonder if I have a note about Gary Gygax. I don't know where it is, but he's at there's an anecdote where he's at a convention and he just says sort of offhandedly like, "Oh, I only roll the dice for the sound that it makes, and then I just make up what happens," and the room just goes dead silent.
Well, you got to remember, this is a guy who since 1978 or 1979, when Advanced Dungeons and Dragons came out, was just endlessly thumping this party line that no, there's one way to do AD&D. The original D&D game, he admits, it was a mess, right? We left everything open to interpretation. We gave referees total latitude to change the rules, groups total latitude to change the rules. But AD&D isn't supposed to be like that. We've thought it all through. We've written much thicker books, much smaller font. They're bigger. Like anything you need to do, you're going to be able to find it. Yet at the same time, when you really, look in the dusty corners of those books, you find a lot of escape valves. You find a lot of places where Gygax is like, actually, if you roll the dice and like what it turns out the dice tell you would happen isn't the way you want the game to go, you can ignore it. Just kind of say something else that happened. And you hear him express these sentiments and why it's so shocking, why you couldn't hear a pin drop in the room after that anecdote you were just telling, which is at a British convention, was because people just couldn't imagine, based on his public statements about this, about how necessary it was to adhere exactly to the letter of AD&D, that of course Gary Gygax would be like, yeah, I don't really do that.
Well, because it seems like, that the role-playing games are kind of a fantasy, right? Like even not, like obviously they take place in like, there's like dragons and wizards and stuff, but it's just like this fantasy of a game where you can do anything, but it's not just playing make-believe, playing pretend like a kid would, that there's rules for this, And it seems like something like that can't really exist. And so much of the discussion in your book is about this question of, how do you have a game where you can do anything and have rules that are finite, and that sort of irreconcilable conflict?
It is. And, it's also about kind of the purpose of those rules at all. And because I think they do have a purpose. It's maybe not the one that you'd think reading a rule book, but I think the rules help players to understand that there are physical laws that are not arbitrary, that govern the world. And I think part of the experience of getting immersed in D&D is believing that, even if it's totally untrue, even if in fact the referee is doing complete freeform resolution, right? And is just kind of making up whatever the answer is going to be. What you see as a player is just, well, I propose to do this action. We talk a lot about something called statements of intention, right? Where you say, well, my character is going to try to do this. And the referee says, okay, here are the results. Really, the feedback you get are the results. Like you may not ever see a die roll that was conducted. Maybe a die roll wasn't conducted. You may not know why when you go to try that door, the DM says it doesn't open. And that, there's a joke in Elusive Shift where I talk about how, there's this product called a DM screen, right? Which is a physical barrier that you put, between yourself as a referee and the players. And this physical barrier exists so they can't see your maps or your die rolls behind it and things like it. But the dialogue, the conversation was always, before there was any physical DM screen, it always shielded the players from understanding why it was that things didn't happen. And like the reductive property of that really it led a lot of people to make skeptical arguments about the value of having any system at all. But I think it's much more that you need to believe that the system is there in order for the fantasy to seem real to you. The more you believe that there's a deterministic world that is kind of, responsible for assembling the things that the referee is describing to you, that there's some nailed down model, it helps you to not always be second guessing, not always be unsure why events happen, because you experience it the same way you experience a real world where there are physical laws and physical rules that we're just kind of, our brains are accustomed to being there. And, bumping up against something that feels just like that, regardless of whether it's total paper mache or an extremely well thought out system, just bumping up against something that feels like that is enough for us to believe in the fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in, before I left New York, I was in a D&D group there, and it was really fun. We would meet up maybe once a month at this sort of beer garden place and play. But I sort of I knew for a fact the DM wasn't going to let any of our characters die, because we had put so much work into the characters. It would be such a nightmare if one of them died. And oh, what, you're just going to re-roll new, I couldn't believe that he would do that, and it would be such a nightmare if he did. But then it's kind of well, wait, what's the point of any of these fights at all? And I actually liked, there was an idea where one of these people said that when a character died, that they had to sort of sacrifice their most powerful magic item to resurrect them. I actually liked that as a that sort of hurts enough to make it meaningful, and you're never going to get that same exact item again, even if you might get something equivalently powerful. But then it's not oh, you have to it doesn't undo all this storytelling work that you've done over months,
Yeah, that's Ed Zimbalist, who designed Chivalry and Sorcery, that was writing about that. And Ed was a big believer in Kismet, as he called it. He has these 2 Kismet essays that I talk about a lot, where Kismet's just, fate, right? And he believed that it's the job of the dungeon master to help create this story and to steer characters towards what the characters want their destinies to be, right? But that, because of that, whenever anything happened that would stop that story, he argued, well, don't stop the story, just make them fail in such a way that they feel that they failed, but that's not going to make it so the story resolution they're trying to reach isn't going to happen. And, it's funny because a lot of people who design games today, RPGs in the indie community, look for this similar property they call fail forward. And, I'm fascinated by how Ed understood the problem. He didn't light on exactly the same solution that people later lighted upon, but what impressed me so much looking at this early literature is how well all the chafing points were understood. Within just a couple of years of these games coming out, and there's a notion we got to do something to fix this, to make it work in a way that for those people who want that storytelling, right, experience, going back to the Blackout categories, or the role-playing experience. If I can't let my character die, I've got too much invested, and that Duke still is on the run, and we've got to get back the ring from him. That tension, I guess, has turned out to be so productive in rule design in the years since the 1970s. In the 70s, they understood the problems better than they probably understood the solutions. I'll put it that way.
Well, because I was not familiar with these games you reference, Flash Gordon and Top Secret, but both of them have this kind of schematic plot map for the story. So in the Secret Agent game, and it follows the formula of a spy thriller where, it's the characters are going to get, and this is a flow chart, right? Where it's the characters get attacked and they can either be captured or escape. And if they're captured, then they're left in some, diabolical contraption or things like that, where it's not a geographical map, but it's a story map. And I thought that was a really interesting way of conceptualizing an RPG.
Yeah, I know Merle Rasmussen, who designed Top Secret, I've been really fortunate to be able to work very closely with him, actually, because I think that game, although it's not as well known today, there is a version of it that's actually out still today that you can get. It introduced a lot of really interesting innovations. And that schematic map, it didn't actually make it into the designed game, but they ran it through the Dragon around the time that the game came out to kind of explain how you could utilize that. But in draft versions of Top Secret, this really was kind of, a path through the story. And because these are formulaic stories, this is when you talk about Flash Gordon as well. Flash Gordon stories are super formulaic, right? You're Flash Gordon, the Emperor Ming is a real problem, and you need to raise some power and overthrow, the overthrow Ming. And like there's no other kind of story that you read in the Flash Gordon serials. And like as a consequence of that, people started thinking about how do you design these games that are pegged very closely to the familiar physics of the story. And I talk about this a bit in the acknowledgments of Elusive Shift. Really, I caught this bug from a guy named Jonathan Tweet, who is an RPG designer who maybe is most known to D&D people for his role in designing 3rd edition D&D, but he also designed an early amazing game called Ars Magica and another called Over the Edge. He's kind of one of the people I really geek out over. So like in 2013, I was over at Peter Adkison's house in Seattle, and he invited Jonathan over. It was the first time I'd ever met him to play some board games with us. And Jonathan was really the one who's like, oh, you're that guy who wrote Playing the World. Oh, yeah, I've heard of you. So, like, tell me, what do you think was the first game that tried not to simulate the physics of a world? Like, how do I hit this? How much encumbrance does this or this do? Kind of a sandbox like that. But instead tried to simulate the course of a particular kind of narrative, particular kind of story. And so that was one of the things I was looking for from the start of this. And yes, Top Secret and Flash Gordon are very convenient things for me to be able to point to in my early conversations with Jonathan and say, well, have you seen this? This is stuff that seems to do precisely that.
Yeah. Well, in this book, I mean, you pretty much keep yourself and your opinions completely out of this book. Do you have opinions about like what kind of RPG experience you prefer?
I mean, so I do keep my opinions out of my books. Overall, that's pretty true. In part, I don't really think the story of the histories of the periods I study is about me. I wasn't there. I was not a participant or a protagonist in this. And so I'm really trying to tell as much as I can, the story of the people who did do this. I mean, if you ask me what kind of games I play myself, I play heavily storytelling, RPG driven games, long, complicated, generally a bit horror infused. You can think I really cut my teeth on, Vampire the Masquerade, the game, and then the LARPs from that, and then a bit of really hacked second ed D&D. And so, yeah, the kinds of games that my friends and I played when I was younger definitely trained me to look for intrigue, kind of mystery, horror elements. I like DMs that keep players definitely in a desperate situation. There's a lot of urgency and maybe less of the dungeon crawling and things like it. But, I play WoW, I play Diablo, I play, Dragon Age and, Elder Scrolls and things like it. So I get plenty of dungeon crawling from games that are designed particularly for that. I really want to get much more into the immersive experience of these stories, which for me, transform my life. I mean, there's no two ways about it.
How so? Did they transform your life?
Well, I mean, when you get deeply into these games, I mean, they change the way you think about everyday experience. I think in my own experience, I mean, when I played a lot of Vampire, I had a friend, he and I used to walk around Boston in the wee hours, and everything we saw, we just sorted into the world of darkness. Right? Like any person we saw, we were speculating if they were a vampire, like what clan they were from. Any building we saw, we would be, the Ventru obviously live here. If we saw a manhole, we'd talk about the Nosferatu. Like these are things that just started to pervade the way that we perceive reality. No, I don't mean that in some, sense like the steam tunnel kid, right? We were confused about whether these games were real or not, but they kind of form this conceptual dimension that helps you understand reality in a more interesting way. And I guess the experiences that I had at that time were very formative for me in the way I think about these games. But again, that doesn't mean that I don't see equal value in doing smash and grabs. I play a lot of convention games these days where it's very much, okay, you're dropped into a scenario and, you're a fighter. What are you going to do? There's, 3 orcs ahead of you and kill. And certainly I know how to do that. I've studied these systems pretty well and I kill well. It's just, if I were running the game, that's not what I would be running.
I mean, do you even have a lot of time to play games these days? I mean, like this book cites 57 zines in the appendix. Like it must have taken an enormous amount of time to write this book.
I mean, I started it in like 2015, and I guess it's just out now at the end of 2020. But I mean, my process is, I will sell no wine before it's time, as the old, I think, Gallo commercials used to say. These are things I work on as a hobby, really, as something that through my own investigations as a collector, as a researcher, I'm constantly engaging with this material. And the things I write are just a side effect, in a way, of my own experience researching and trying to understand these games. And Elusive Shift is just a good example of something I could break off as a chunk that tells an interesting part of the story that's relatively self-contained and kind of has its own narrative and flow through it. But I mean, to me, these are just manifestations of the amount of time I invest into just collecting, identifying what do I want to collect and collecting it. And then B, synthesizing all that and trying to think, well, what can I learn from it? And I hope people enjoy reading things like it. I mean, it's like I said, this is a pretty crunchy book. Elusive Shift is, compared to things I worked on like Art and Arcana and Heroes Beast, I'd say it's much less accessible. It's again published by MIT Press. It's certainly targeting more of the very very hardcore audience that are into RPGs. If you're designing RPGs, I think it's potentially of interest, but probably not for casual readers.
One of these interviews I listened to with you, you said that you'll talk to a lot of academics and they'll say that they're jealous of you, that you can, have such a singular focus on just the facts of what happened historically, that if you're in academia, I guess there's more pressure to have some sort of ideological filter for everything, and that as an independent scholar, you can just focus more on here's what historically happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a bit of that. Like, there isn't a lot of Marxism or anything like that in Elusive Shift. But I mean, there certainly are, working especially with this period, there are serious questions, social questions really, about like who got to participate in these games, about, what, how white and how male and how middle class and homogenous the community was for the 1970s that approached these. And I certainly don't try to sweep those under the rug by any stretch of the imagination, but it's really difficult to actually doing what I do, which is largely working with documentary sources, right? It can be hard to find more kind of inclusive examples of communities that were diverse in the 70s. I mean, this part of the problem is by the 80s and then certainly the 90s, the RPG community become very much more diverse. And today I'd say we've made real progress in that. So it's not that I don't want to engage with some issues that maybe some people consider to be ideological, but it's unfortunately like a side effect of what I'm focusing on, the period I am focusing on in this. Like, if you wanted to write a book about, things that undergraduates worked on at Princeton in the 1960s, it would be hard to find voices that weren't, white and male and things like that, just because of I don't think the university even admitted women as regular students till like 1969, right? These were times that were very different from our times. And, that's a challenge for me. And it's always a disappointment to me, right, that I can't do better in that regard. I should work on something else. If I worked on something else, I could do better.
Well, I mean, the big sort of battle over inclusion that comes up in the Elusive Shift is the Munchkins versus the Grog Nerds. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I went after the origins of terms like Munchkin and very similar things a lot. Ageism is certainly a huge dimension of how the shift, if whatever we consider the shift to be, happened. Because when AD&D came out, there was, due to a variety of historical things, really, an influx of very young new players who wanted to play D&D, who were really only knew it from the Dragon and from the AD&D books, and had seen, as I referred to earlier, kind of Gygax saying, like, this is the one true way to do it, and would show up at game conventions or local game clubs at your friendly local game store and, be facing these people who've been playing since 1975 who have a very different view of what it is to engage with Dungeons and Dragons than kind of just what was in some source books that came out in like 1978 and 1979. And that conflict, it had a few ramifications, but one of which is that it really solidified this idea that there was an intellectual avant-garde of people that were interested in a deeper form of role-playing. It was a reaction against these kids. I think the dictionary definition of munchkin you see in the literature then is like under 16. But, let's be fair, by, the early 1980s, like, 2/3 of D&D product that was being purchased for people between the ages of 10 and 14. And so this demographic trended sharply lower from what used to be mostly college age players to something that's, predominantly, tweens, right? And yeah, that caused all kinds of tensions in the industry. But the irony is, of course, those munchkins grew up. And when those munchkins did grow up, I mean, people like Jonathan Tweet, I just mentioned, is a great example of this, was a munchkin in that period, was one of the kids that came in from that. And, as he grew up and got more sophisticated and started thinking more about these games, he found his way to Alarms and Excursions in the late 1980s and engaged in the discussions that were still going on there, as they had been now for 15 years, perhaps. And was always just trying to find the way to create the best spontaneous story you could if you put a group of people around a table.
I know that that Dungeons and Dragons, or I've heard that it's selling better now than it ever has. And I'm just curious, do you have any sense of how many of the people playing it now are kind of people sort of middle-aged, rediscovering their childhoods, and how many 14-year-olds, like munchkins, are picking up D&D now for the first time?
I mean, I don't know if I have those demographics really fresh in my mind, but my recollection is it is primarily younger people that are responsible for as you say, the unprecedented sales of the game that are out there now. It isn't just a nostalgia thing. I mean, the numbers are so big, they wouldn't support it being a nostalgia thing. This is a lot of teenagers. I'd say more late teens than early teens, though, I would expect in the fullness of time that Wizards will have products targeting any possible person that wants to get engaged with D&D. And to me, it's great to see these people that have been turned on by like Critical Role, right? Who have seen these things through YouTube, through Twitch, through social media, and have kind of come to, be able to understand the game by watching people who play it quite well, week after week, just unveiling these like deeper and deeper stories that drag you more and more in. And the ability, back in the day in the 1970s, you didn't have something like that, right? To learn, you'd have to go to a convention or, play with an established group to kind of get a sense of what this game even really meant. And that now you can just watch it on YouTube and get hooked on somebody's story and then just get together with your friends and decide what kind of story do we want to have and use the 5e books to get you there. That's really what's created this incredible moment that we have now for D&D.
Yeah, that's great. I guess just before we run out of time, I just wanted to mention a couple sort of interesting intersections between fantasy and science fiction literature and Dungeons and Dragons. So I knew obviously that H.G. Wells had been really pivotal in the formation of tabletop gaming with his book Little Wars. But I didn't realize until I think I was just listening to an interview with you, but that Robert Louis Stevenson was also, a major figure in the development of tabletop games. So that's a pretty interesting, that they were both such major novelists and such major figures in tabletop gaming.
Yeah, you'd think there must be some kind of connection here. So it's really fascinating. I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson obviously throughout his life had health problems. And so in the early 1880s, he was holed up in Davos in Switzerland, where I guess the air is good for you if you have respiratory problems. And he had a stepson. And kind of to get closer to his stepson, he was playing this war game that he invented with him. And although Stevenson never published his rules, his stepson wrote this whole piece about it that you could read that kind of describes what they were playing and how Stevenson integrated his stories. And he would kind of create these characters of war correspondents who would be witnessing the war that was going on in their tabletop and writing about it. And Wells was doing the same thing, right? When Wells wrote Little Wars, he has a whole narrative section of it where he talks about assuming this character. There's even almost like a Jekyll and Hyde moment in the way that Wells describes himself transforming from this, academic sort of guy, right, into someone with a dueling scar who has been, veteran of many, many battles. And he really wants to get into the character, at least for the purposes of explaining how the game works. And this connection just goes on, and we can point to people like Fritz Leiber, who is pretty well known for having created Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Fritz Leiber designed a war game based on his world of Lankhmar that he couldn't really figure out how to publish. And it wouldn't be until TSR came about and D&D had started to become successful that they reached out to him and said, we'd love to do a version of your Lankhmar board game, which they did in 1976. And so the literary connections they're just endless. And I think they are inseparable. I think crucially, war games have never been as far from stories as some of those people may have thought they were.
Well, I thought it was so funny because there's this thing called the Monty Hall campaign where, like one of these fanzines, somebody writes in and says, oh, I play a 250th level wizard and somebody else in my party is a 1000th level fighter. And there's this natural tendency to say, guys, you're doing this completely wrong, But then somebody had this really interesting observation where they say that that The Hobbit, that J.R.R. Tolkien's novel The Hobbit, is basically a Monty Hall campaign. That Bilbo is a first level hobbit, and almost immediately he gets this awesome magic sword and the most powerful ring in the world. And I thought that was a really funny observation.
Yeah. And, if you look at any fairy tale, right, and ask yourself, people in fairy tales who get great magic and have access to this stuff, did they deserve it? Right? What did they do? Did they slay enough orcs to warrant getting that? And oftentimes they don't, right? And people did use this to push back on, especially the fundamental experience metric of D&D. And this was widely criticized early on by people who felt that, the hunt for power was actually something that impeded role playing, right? That really you if you're just concerned about how much your experience point total is going up from moment to moment, and that's your incentive for playing, that's something that doesn't make you in character, it makes you out of character. And there were people who felt that was a bad thing. We should figure out a way to fix it. And fascinatingly, some people fixed it by figuring out ways to take things like alignment, right? The way you're supposed to be good or evil in this game, and connect them to the experience system so that you would get more experience. For example, if you were being good, if you're supposed to be good, and if you were being bad, your experience returns would be 20% less or something. And you find all these kind of behavior steering mechanisms that are part of that whole discussion of how you would design a game to get people to role play.
Yeah. No, this is so interesting, and everyone should definitely check out this book. We're pretty much out of time, so do you have any final thoughts, or are you working on any other books along these lines?
There's definitely more coming. I don't think anything I'm going to be talking about today. I think the next two things I'm working on are both not as crunchy and academic as this one is, but definitely if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I hope I'm delivering in Elusive Shift some new information, and certainly covers a lot of very obscure fanzines, very obscure early small press RPGs. And, so I think if you're interested in collecting these things, there's some good bibliographic data and stuff like that in it. It's a lot of fun for me to do. I hope other people find the discussion of this as much fun as I do. And, I just really want to say thanks for having me on, David. This has been a great conversation.
Oh, yeah, thanks so much. And let me just mention, too, that I haven't read your earlier book, Playing at the Worlds, and everyone just talks about it as being sort of the definitive book on this subject. And I didn't even realize, but it's 750 pages long. I think you mentioned at the beginning it's 400,000 words or something. So, yeah. I don't know if I would have had time to read it for this interview, so I'm glad that this one's a little shorter. But I definitely, right. I'll have to read that sometime.
Yeah, it's one thing I will say about it is it's split up pretty in a modular way by topic, so it's easy to take on bites of it here and there. And it was really, especially the middle parts of it, were designed to be kind of more an a la carte than a prefix. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, definitely going to check that out. And so we've been speaking with Jon Peterson about his new book, The Elusive Shift. So, Jon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Jon Peterson for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.